Christmas morning arrived at Beller Plantation with all the grandeur and ceremony befitting one of Louisiana's most notable estates. The year was 1847, and Henry Dufresne had every reason to feel joy. At 32 years old he had inherited his father's sugar empire just 6 months earlier, transforming from the younger son into the master of 3,000 acres and 170 souls. The mansion gleamed with crystal chandeliers imported from Paris at great expense, and the aroma of roasted duck mingled with the scent of pine garlands throughout the grand parlor. Outside, the December air carried a sharper chill than usual for Louisiana, and frost had edged the fountain in the courtyard, forming delicate icy patterns that sparkled in the morning light. The household had been preparing for this day for weeks. The kitchen staff had labored through the night, producing elaborate dishes to grace the long mahogany table in the dining room. The house slaves had polished every surface until it shone, hung wreaths on every door, and arranged candles in every window. It was a display of wealth and refinement that could impress even the most discerning visitors from New Orleans society. Yet the gift waiting for him in the courtyard would unravel everything Henry thought he knew about his family, his legacy, and himself. Henry descended the front steps of the mansion with the confident stride of a man who had finally come into his inheritance. His older brother, Phipe, had been groomed from birth to manage Beller, while Henry had been sent to New Orleans to study law, expected to make his own way in the world. But yellow fever had taken Phipe 3 years ago, and their father had passed away just 6 months ago, leaving Henry as the sole heir to everything the Dufresne family had built over 3 generations. The transition had been difficult. The overseers questioned his authority. Neighboring planters watched for signs of weakness, and Henry himself struggled under the weight of responsibility. He had spent his 20s enjoying the relative freedom of the city, arguing cases in court, attending theaters, and savoring the cosmopolitan pleasures of New Orleans. Now he was tied to this land, to these people, to a life he had never fully embraced. Charles Beaumont stood beside the fountain with the quiet satisfaction of a man confident in his choice of gift. Charles was Henry's closest friend from New Orleans days, a successful cotton broker who had guided Henry through complex business dealings that kept Beller profitable. He was a few years older than Henry, already showing gray at the temples, carrying the calm confidence of someone born into position and wealth. "Merry Christmas, my friend," Charles called as Henry approached. "I know you've been searching for someone skilled in household management. Your mother's old housekeeper passed away last spring, and I hear you've been struggling to find a suitable replacement. This one comes highly recommended, literate, polite, trained in refined service. Her previous owner was settling debts in Natchez. The moment I saw her records, I thought of you immediately." Henry's gaze shifted to the woman standing beside Charles. She wore a simple gray dress, clean but well worn, with careful stitching visible at the cuffs and hem. Her hair was wrapped in a faded blue cloth, worn but arranged with dignity rather than neglect. She could not have been more than 25, with features suggesting mixed heritage, high cheekbones that caught the morning light, amber eyes that held deep, unspoken experience, and honey-toned skin. A small silver locket hung around her neck, the only ornament she possessed, glinting softly as she breathed. She stood motionless beside the fountain, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the cobblestones. There was a calm presence about her, a sense of being accustomed to observation yet trained to remain unseen, quietly present but withdrawn. Henry approached slowly, studying her with the practiced eye of a man raised to evaluate human property as if it were livestock, a skill he had never felt comfortable using. He remembered his father teaching him to judge health and value by teeth, hands, and posture. The memory left a chill in him he could not explain. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than intended. "Margaret, sir." Her voice was gentle yet clear, carrying a French accent that hinted at education beyond what most enslaved people received. "Margaret," he repeated, testing the name. It was a French name, common in Louisiana, yet something in the way she said it stirred a strange feeling in his chest, a memory half remembered, a shadow of something just out of reach. "Look at me." She raised her eyes slowly, and in that instant Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. Those eyes, amber flecked with green, were familiar. He had seen them before every morning in the mirror, in the reflected light on his face. They mirrored the eyes in the portrait of his father hanging in the library, painted when Eddie Dufresne had been in his prime. The resemblance was uncanny, the oval face, strong jawline, determined yet calm, the slight tilt of her head when listening, the crease of concentration between her brows, all of it mirrored his own features with an unsettling precision. His breath caught. Charles's voice went on, speaking of her skills, her previous family in Natchez, her references, but Henry barely heard a word. His mind raced, drawing connections he did not want to see, recognizing patterns he wished he could unsee. "Where were you born?" The words slipped out sharper than he intended, cutting through Charles's description. "New Orleans, Sir Andrew Dolphin." Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, or cautious wariness. She had noticed his reaction. Henry's hands went cold despite the mild morning air. His father had owned a townhouse on Rudolphine Street, visiting often on business. His mother had never asked questions, or if she did, had kept them private. Henry had been sent once, at 15, to deliver papers. He remembered little: a courtyard with flowers, blue wallpaper with birds, a woman answering the door, a child peeking behind her skirts. Suddenly the memory sharpened with terrible clarity. The child had been 7 or 8, amber-eyed, staring at him openly. He had thought nothing of it, assuming she was a servant's daughter. He had not recognized her. "Who was your mother?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, a flicker of pain crossing her eyes. "Her name was Celeste, sir, Celeste Dubois. She died when I was 12. The timeline fit with dreadful precision. Henry had been 19 when Margaret was born, away at university, absorbed in study and society. His father would have been 53, still traveling, maintaining secret arrangements hidden from Beller, from his wife, from legitimate children. Charles watched, confusion growing, his smile fading. "Henry, is something wrong? If she's not suitable, I can return her to the dealer. There's no obligation, I just thought—" "No," Henry interrupted, his voice strained but controlled. "She's fine. Thank you, Charles, very generous indeed." Yet his mind refused peace. Perhaps it was coincidence, he told himself. Perhaps many in Louisiana had amber eyes and French features. Perhaps he was imagining connections, driven by guilt over the system he inherited with his father's wealth, seeking reasons to feel unease. Yet deep down he knew the truth. In that place where understanding comes before words, the woman before him, presented as a gift like furniture or livestock, was his sister, his half-sister. Born to an enslaved mother his father had kept, raised with his father's money, and then sold into the system, only to now legally belong to him, subject to his command. His sister was his slave. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. Charles continued speaking, outlining the arrangements he had made, the price he had paid, the official papers that still needed signatures. Henry forced himself to pay attention, to answer correctly, to play the part of the grateful recipient of a generous gift. He thanked Charles repeatedly, invited him to stay for Christmas dinner, and called one of the household servants to guide Margaret to her quarters. As she followed the servant into the house, Margaret glanced back for a single moment, her amber eyes locking with his. In that fleeting instant, Henry felt a tightness in his chest. A spark of recognition, of understanding, of unspoken knowledge passed between them. She either knew or at least suspected. She had noticed the resemblance, had drawn the same terrifying conclusions he had. And now they were both caught in circumstances neither had chosen, bound together by blood and law in a way that made any real relationship impossible. Henry couldn't stop thinking about it. If you are drawn to this grim story from Louisiana's history, please subscribe to Antebellum South and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our historical mysteries. I also want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and share your city or state. Back at Beller Plantation, Henry was on the brink of uncovering just how deep his father's secrets truly ran. That night, sleep eluded him. Christmas dinner had been unbearable. Charles and several other plantation neighbors filled the dining room with boisterous conversation and laughter, while Henry forced a smile and tried to appear composed. Margaret moved gracefully among the staff, quietly giving instructions, and every glimpse of her profile felt like a knife in his heart. By 30 odors a.m., unable to bear the darkness and the weight of his thoughts, he rose, dressed silently, and went to his father's study. If there were answers, they would be here, among the ledgers and correspondences that chronicled 3 decades of plantation life. The study was unchanged since his father's death. Henry hadn't touched a thing in 6 months. The massive desk still bore his father's favorite pen, the one with the silver nib used to sign every important document. Shelves were lined with books, legal texts, agricultural manuals, histories of Louisiana and France. The air carried the faint scent of his father's Cuban tobacco blend. Henry lit the oil lamp and began searching. He started with the financial ledgers, carefully maintained with meticulous precision. Eddie Dufresne had been a man who trusted documentation, ensuring every expense, transaction, and payment was recorded down to the last penny. Henry worked backward through the years, searching for payments connected to the Rue Dauphine property. They appeared: monthly maintenance payments, occasional larger sums for repairs or furnishings. The sums were significant but reasonable, the kind needed to maintain a city townhouse in New Orleans. But there were other entries too. Regular payments to someone noted only as CD in the ledgers. These payments had continued for 25 years, abruptly stopping 8 months before his father's death. The amounts fluctuated, sometimes $50, sometimes $100, occasionally more. Over time, they accumulated into a substantial sum, enough to support a comfortable life in New Orleans. Margaret had said her mother died when she was 12. If Margaret was 25 now, that would place her mother's death 13 years prior. The timeline didn't match. Henry pulled out another ledger, this one holding copies of correspondence. His father had kept duplicates of all important letters, carefully organized by year. Flipping through 1834, the year Margaret would have been born, he found nothing unusual. But in 1835, he discovered a letter from a New Orleans lawyer confirming the purchase of a house on Rue Dauphine and the establishment of a trust to maintain it. The letter was formal, business-like, telling nothing of the human story behind it, but pinned to it was a tiny scrap of paper, folded repeatedly until it was no bigger than a postage stamp. Henry's hands shook as he unfolded it, smoothing the creases. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, disciplined, the kind taught with patience over years. It read, "Eden, she has your eyes. I named her Margaret after your mother. I asked nothing for myself, only that she might have a chance at something better than I had. Let her learn to read. Let her know beauty. Let her believe, even if only for a little while, that the world can be kind." Henry sank into the chair, the letter slipping from his hands onto the desk. His grandmother's name had been Margaret. He had never known her. She had died before he was born, but he had heard stories. Cultured, refined, educated in France, she had insisted on French tutors for her sons. His father had spoken of her with reverence, keeping her portrait in his bedroom until the day he died. Naming the daughter of an enslaved woman after his mother, it was cruelly ironic. The reality struck him like a physical blow. His father had acknowledged Margaret just enough to provide for her education, give her a home, ensure she had opportunities. But he had never freed her. He had never legitimized her existence. She remained in shadows, a secret managed with money and distance. Henry continued searching through the night, uncovering more pieces of the puzzle. Receipts for piano lessons dating back to when Margaret would have been 6. Bills for books, not just primers but poetry, literature, philosophy. Payments to a dressmaker for clothes suitable for a young lady of society, not a child in bondage. His father had given Margaret a remarkable education for any woman of that era, whether enslaved or free, yet had kept her in chains. That fact gnawed at him, relentless as the night wore on. The lamp oil dwindled, and Henry felt the weight of what his father could have done. Manumission was legally possible, though complicated. Yet Eddie Dufresne had chosen not to act. Why? Henry realized with bitter clarity. Acknowledgement would have required recognition. It would have raised questions about Margaret, about her father. It would have unsettled the careful social order Eddie had cultivated. Better to keep them comfortable but powerless, provided for yet controlled. Better to sustain the illusion that they were merely property, rather than family too threatening to claim. As dawn painted the sky over Beller in pink and gold, Henry discovered one final document, tucked in the back of an 1846 ledger. A letter from the same New Orleans lawyer informed Eddie that Celeste Dubois had died, requesting directions about her property and her daughter's future. His father's response was clipped and unyielding. Continue the trust for the property. Make no changes regarding the girl. She is to remain as she is until further notice. ID. She was to remain enslaved, vulnerable, subject to whatever fate might come when the trust ended or circumstances shifted. And circumstances had changed. The trust ended with his father's death. Margaret had been sold to settle debts or accounts, passing through strangers' hands, appraised like livestock, and ultimately bought as a Christmas gift for her own half-brother. Henry thought of his father's funeral, the grand Catholic ceremony, attended by the governor. The bishop's eulogy praised Eddie Dufresne as a man of honor, generosity, and a pillar of the community. What would they say if they knew of the woman on Rue Dauphine, of the daughter treated as property, of the son who now owned his own sister? The household began stirring. Kitchen staff clattered, murmurs of morning conversation drifting through the halls. Somewhere in that activity, Margaret began her first full day at Beller, unaware of the blood tying her to the man now in charge. Or was she unaware? That question haunted Henry. Had Celeste told her the truth about her father? Or had she been protected from that knowledge, spared the pain of knowing she was connected by blood to a man who would never recognize her? Henry needed answers, but he could not ask outright. To do so would reveal his own knowledge and create a dangerous, inescapable situation. He had to proceed with caution, with strategy, learning the truth without exposing himself. The morning after Christmas rose gray and cold, the fog rolling in from the river and settling over the land. Beller lay over the land like a heavy shroud. Henry emerged from the study utterly drained, his eyes stinging from sleepless nights and hours spent poring over books by lamplight. He had uncovered so much, yet the most vital question remained unanswered. Did Margaret know who her father was? Had she recognized the connection he had felt the moment their eyes met in the courtyard? He found her in the morning room of the main house, which looked out onto the gardens. She was directing two other enslaved women, guiding them as they arranged furniture and cleaned the windows. She moved with calm efficiency, her directions clear and measured. The other women followed her instructions with a deference that suggested she had already claimed her place in the household hierarchy, despite having arrived just yesterday. Margaret, Henry called from the doorway. She turned at once, her face carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. I would like to speak with you in the library." He noticed a brief flicker of worry in her eyes, quickly hidden. She followed him down the hall, keeping a respectful distance, 3 steps behind, never beside him. Her feet made almost no sound on the polished wooden floors. It was a practiced dance, the careful choreography of servitude designed to keep enslaved people safe by remaining unseen. The library was Henry's favorite room, walls lined floor to ceiling with books his father had collected over decades. Many had never been read, purchased more for show than understanding. Yet Henry had always loved the room, the smell of leather and paper, the way sunlight filtered through tall windows, the sense of being surrounded by knowledge and possibility. As a child it had been his refuge from the harshness of plantation life. Now it felt like a confessional. "Close the door," Henry said, and watched as she hesitated briefly before obeying. He knew how it must appear, the master summoning a female slave into his private study, instructing her to close the door. The implication was ugly and unavoidable. He needed to make it clear that this was not that kind of conversation. "You said you can read," Henry began, gesturing to the shelves around them. "Yes, sir. That's unusual. How did you learn?" "My mother arranged lessons when I was little. She thought education was important." Margaret's voice was calm, but Henry sensed the effort behind it, the careful selection of each word. "Your mother must have been remarkable." A subtle change softened Margaret's expression, a glimpse of real emotion breaking through her controlled mask. "She was, sir, the most remarkable person I ever knew. She died believing I would have a better life than she did." The weight of those words filled the air, heavy with bitter irony. Celeste had died hoping her daughter would be protected, educated, prepared to face the world. Instead, Margaret had been sold, reduced to property, and had landed in the household of her own brother. "And your father?" Henry asked, forcing casualness into his tone. "Did you ever know him?" Margaret's face became a mask again, blank and unreadable. "No, sir. My mother never spoke of him." Perhaps it was the truth, or perhaps it was the answer she had learned to give, the safe reply that preserved both her mother's memory and her own safety. Henry couldn't tell. He studied her face, seeking any sign, any flicker of knowledge, but she had been trained too well to conceal herself, to reveal only what was safe. "I see." Henry moved to the window, looking out at the grounds. The sugarcane fields stretched to the horizon, brown and still in the winter cold. Soon they would be green again, growing toward the relentless harvest that would consume every waking hour from August through December. The cycle never changed, year after year, generation after generation. "You'll work in the main house," he said finally, still gazing outward. "Household management, as Charles mentioned. You'll report directly to me, not the overseer. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "You'll have your own room in the house, not in the quarters. You'll eat with the other house staff, and you will be treated with respect. And if anyone at all treats you otherwise, you will tell me immediately. Do you understand?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly. It was a strange speech for a master to give a newly acquired slave. Henry saw her trying to grasp its meaning. Was it kindness, or something more complicated and dangerous? "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, revealing nothing. "That's all. You may go." She left quickly, and Henry sank into his father's chair, feeling the crushing weight of inheritance pressing down like a physical force. He owned his sister. The law granted him full control. He could sell her, punish her, use her however he wished, and no one would question it. The thought made him nauseous. He spent the rest of the morning attempting to focus on plantation accounts, but his mind kept returning to Margaret and the impossible predicament his father had created. Freeing her immediately was not an option. The legal process for manumission was complicated, requiring parish approval and a bond to ensure the freed person wouldn't become a burden on the state. Any sudden act of freedom would invite scrutiny and raise uncomfortable questions. And what would he tell people? That he had discovered she was his sister, which would mean exposing his father's secret and destroying the Dufresne family's reputation. The scandal would be catastrophic, threatening his social standing, his business, and even Bella itself, yet keeping her enslaved was morally unbearable. Every moment she remained his property perpetuated the injustice his father had imposed. Henry was caught between two impossible choices, unsure of which path to take. The weeks after Christmas passed in tense, uneasy balance. Margaret proved every bit of what Charles had promised: efficient, intelligent, and capable. She managed the household with skill that impressed even the long-serving staff who had been with the Dufresnes for decades. She moved through Bella like a quiet shadow, present but never intrusive, anticipating needs before they were spoken, handling the complex workings of a large household with apparent ease. Henry watched her constantly, searching for signs that she knew the truth. Occasionally he caught her staring at his father's portrait in the library, expression unreadable. The painting showed Eddie N. Dufresne in his prime, perhaps 40, dressed formally, one hand resting on a globe, a symbol of worldly power. The artist had captured an unsettling intensity in his eyes that Henry had always found disquieting. One day Henry found Margaret in the music room, standing before his mother's grand piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys but didn't play, as if remembering something long past or restraining herself from doing what she yearned to do. "Do you play?" Henry asked from the doorway. She jumped back. "I did, sir. Once. My mother arranged lessons for me when I was young," Margaret said. "Play something now, please," Henry said firmly. Music had a way of revealing truth, cutting through the careful masks people wore. She sat slowly at the piano, posture tense. Her fingers found the keys, and after a pause, she began to play. The piece was precise, technically skilled, a nocturne showing years of training, but it was the emotion that struck Henry most. A deep, aching sadness poured from her hands, filling the room with nearly unbearable grief. The notes were exact and controlled, yet conveyed a world of feeling. Henry held his breath, captivated by the beauty and sorrow. This was no casual accomplishment. It was the music of someone who had poured their soul into the instrument, finding in it a sanctuary from a harsh world. When she finished, silence pressed down like a weight. Henry realized his hands were clenched and jaw tight. He forced himself to relax and breathe. "Where did you learn that?" His voice sounded rougher than intended. "My mother's house, sir. We had a piano. She said music could take you to places you might never reach otherwise. She would sit with me while I practiced for hours, telling me that no matter what happened, no matter where I ended up, the music would always belong to me. No one could ever take it away." Margaret's voice was soft, almost dreamlike, like a memory she was touching again. "Your mother's house," Henry repeated, throat tight. Margaret's hands stayed on the keys, still and silent. "Yes, sir." "Tell me about it, the house." She paused, quiet for a long moment, then spoke softly, almost dreamily. "It was small yet beautiful. There were flowers in the courtyard, jasmine and roses. My mother kept. She trimmed them gently, speaking to them softly as she worked, careful with every cut. She said plants could feel love, that they grew stronger when they were cared for with patience and attention." The parlor was covered in blue wallpaper decorated with silver birds. "I used to count those birds when I was meant to be practicing the piano. There were 47 birds on that wall. I counted them again and again, hundreds of times, and the number never changed. It was always 47. Henry felt his throat tighten. He had been inside that house once, many years earlier. His father had sent him there to deliver documents to the lawyer who handled the property. He had been about 15, too young to truly understand what he was seeing, too innocent to question why his father kept another home in the city. He remembered the courtyard, the flowers, the blue walls with silver birds. He remembered a woman opening the door, Celeste, though he had not known her name then, and a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, peeking out from behind her skirts and staring at him with curious amber eyes. He had stood in front of his sister and not known who she was. They had shared the same room, breathed the same air, and yet she had meant nothing to him at the time. "What happened to the house?" he asked. Even though he already knew the answer from the papers he had discovered. "It was sold after my mother died. The lawyer said the arrangement was over, and that there was no place for me to stay there anymore. I was sent to work for a family in the Garden District. They were kind enough. The mistress taught me fine needlework, and I was allowed to keep reading when my chores were done. But 3 years later, when they fell into hard times, they sold me to pay their debts." She spoke calmly, as if she were talking about the weather and not the breaking apart of her entire life. "I learned that nothing lasts, sir. Not homes, not promises, not kindness. Anything can be taken away." The calm acceptance in her voice hurt more than anger ever could. She had trained herself to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to take whatever fate gave her without complaint. Henry understood it was how she survived, how she protected herself in a world that treated her as property instead of a person. "You may play whenever you wish," he said suddenly. "The piano is here. It sits unused. My mother played it before she died. My father had it cared for, but he never played it himself. It should be used. Music should not be silent." She looked at him, surprise breaking through her careful expression. "Sir, the piano?" "Yes," he said. "Use it. Play whenever you have the time. Think of it as part of your duties if that helps. A piano needs to be played often to stay in good shape." "Thank you, sir." Her voice was almost a whisper, but Henry heard what lay beneath it. Gratitude, yes, but also confusion and deep tiredness. She was trying to understand why he was being kind, what he expected in return. Henry left the room quickly, before he said something he could not take back, before he confessed the truth burning inside him. He could not free her, not yet. The law was complicated, and a sudden act of freedom would raise questions he was not ready to answer. Still, he could offer small kindnesses, small moments of dignity within the narrow limits of her life. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he could give without tearing everything apart. Just when we thought we had uncovered all the secrets of the Duffing family, the situation at Beller became even more tangled. If this story sends chills down your spine, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Press like to support our work and subscribe to Antebellum South so you never miss stories like this. Let us uncover together what happens next. As Henry struggled with the burden he had inherited, spring arrived at Beller with its usual rush of growth and movement. The sugar-cane fields turned green almost overnight. The air grew heavy with moisture, making every breath feel thick and wet, and the pace of work increased across the plantation. Henry threw himself into his responsibilities with near desperation, hoping to drown his thoughts in schedules, numbers, and endless tasks. He met daily with the overseers, reviewed work plans, and tried to ensure that the enslaved workers were treated as humanly as the cruel system allowed. He walked the fields, checked the tools, and inspected the sugar mill that would thunder to life during harvest. He studied the accounts, bargained with buyers in New Orleans, and handled the countless small problems that never stopped on a plantation as large as Beller. Still, he could not escape the core problem of his life. Margaret was everywhere, running the household, supervising the kitchen, keeping everything in order. Each time he saw her, heard her voice, or caught sight of her profile, he was reminded of the impossible situation his father had left behind. The other house servants accepted her authority quickly. She gave instructions firmly but with respect, and she never asked anyone to do work she would not do herself. Henry often saw her working beside the others, sleeves rolled up as she helped with washing or cooking. The field workers were more cautious. To them she was someone raised above them, given small privileges they would never have. Henry noticed the looks, heard the whispers when she passed. There was resentment, and he understood why. In a world built on oppression, any small advantage felt like a loss to someone else. In April, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from New Orleans, from the law office of Bogart and Associates. Henry opened it in his study, expecting routine business, perhaps a contract or payment needing approval. Instead, the words made his blood turn cold. "Dear Mr. Dufresne," the letter began in the careful, formal language lawyers favored. "It is my duty to inform you of a matter concerning your late father's estate that has recently come to our attention. Among the papers of my late partner, Mr. Alphonse Bogart, who passed away last month, we discovered a sealed document dated 1834. It contained instructions that it be delivered to Eddie Dufresne's heir once certain conditions were met. Those conditions have now been fulfilled, and I am bound by my partner's agreement to send this document to you. It is enclosed. Should you have questions, I remain at your service. Respectfully, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, attorney at law." Inside was a smaller envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax, stamped by his father's signet ring. The seal was intact. No one had read it in 13 years. Henry's hands trembled as he broke it open. His father's handwriting appeared firm and clear despite time. The ink had faded from black to brown, but the words were sharp. "Henry," it began. The use of his name so direct and personal made his stomach knot. His father rarely wrote to him that way. "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and events have occurred that I hoped never would. I am a coward for not telling you this while I lived, but I cannot face my grave without leaving you the truth. In 1833 I met a woman named Celeste Dubois. She was enslaved, owned by a merchant preparing to return to France. I told myself I bought her freedom. In truth, I bought her and bound her to me just as tightly as any chain. She was educated, cultured, and more refined than many white women I knew. She spoke French fluently, played the piano beautifully, and had read more books than most men. I believed I loved her, but I loved my comfort and my reputation more. When she told me she carried my child, I chose myself. I could have freed them both. I could have claimed my daughter and faced the scandal. Instead, I created the house on Rue Dauphine. I supported them with money. I visited when I could, which was far too rarely. I told myself it was enough. It was not love. It was fear dressed as responsibility. Margaret, my daughter, your sister, grew up knowing her father would never claim her. Celeste never told her my name, but she knew I existed and that I chose my lawful family over her. I saw that knowledge in her eyes and did nothing. I tell you this because the trust I created ends with Celeste's death. I made no further plans because I lacked the courage to explain. If Margaret has been sold, if she has fallen into the system I benefited from, you must find her, you must free her. You must give her the life I refuse to give. This is not a request. It is a command and a plea from a man who failed in the deepest way possible. Make this right. Do what I could not do. Be the man I failed to be. I have left instructions with Bard to deliver this letter to you only if two conditions are met. First, that I am dead. Second, that Celeste has also passed away. If you are reading this, then both conditions have been fulfilled and Margaret is alone in the world, exposed to whatever fate may fall upon her. Find her. Free her. Give her the family she should have had from the very beginning. Your father, Eddie Duffing. Henry read the letter 3 times. Each reading brought new waves of emotion, anger, grief, disgust, and a crushing, unbearable sense of responsibility. His father had known. He had known exactly what could happen, and he had done nothing to stop it. He had written this letter 13 years ago, when Margaret was only 12. Then he had lived another 13 years without acting on it. 13 years in which he could have freed Margaret himself. 13 years in which he could have faced the consequences of his choices. 13 years in which he could have done the right thing. Instead, he had died and left his son to inherit not only his land and wealth, but also his sins. The timing made it worse. The letter had been written when Margaret was 12, and his father had lived 13 more years after that. Years in which he continued the arrangement, continued the payments, continued visiting the house on Rue Dolphin whenever business brought him to New Orleans. Then he died, leaving Henry to clean up what he had refused to face. Henry stood and walked to the window, the letter crushed in his hand. Outside, the plantation was full of movement. Enslaved workers moved through the fields, tending to the young cane plants. The overseer rode among them on horseback, watching closely, ready to enforce discipline if anyone slowed. It was a scene Henry had seen thousands of times, so familiar it had faded into the background of his life. But now he saw it clearly. Every person in those fields was someone's child, someone's brother or sister. Each had a history, a family, a life torn apart by the system that enriched families like the Duffings, and Henry was part of that system. He benefited from it. He kept it alive every day he remained at Beller. The realization made him feel sick. He returned to the desk and smoothed the letter flat, reading it one final time. His father's words seemed to mock him from the page. Make this right. Do what I could not. But how was he supposed to make right something so deeply wrong? How was he supposed to give Margaret the family she deserved when that family had been built on slavery? When the money that could support her came from the suffering of people just like her? There were no clean answers, only choices, and each carried its own heavy cost. Henry spent 3 days trying to decide. He could free Margaret immediately, but that would raise questions he was not ready to answer. He could send her away with money and papers, but that felt like another abandonment, another man in her life choosing the easy path instead of the right one. He could tell her the truth, but what good would that do? What comfort was there in knowing that her brother owned her, that the family she was denied had become her prison? In the end, the decision was taken from him. He was in the library late one evening. His father's letter lay open on the desk when he heard a soft knock. Before he could answer, Margaret entered, carrying a tray with coffee and brandy. It was her habit to bring him refreshments in the evenings, a quiet service she offered without being asked. She placed the tray on the side table and turned to leave. "Wait," Henry said. She stopped, her hand resting on the door handle. "Close the door," she did, her face cautious. Henry suddenly understood how this looked. A master calling a female slave into his private room late at night and ordering the door closed. The meaning was obvious and sickening. He needed to speak quickly. "And I need to tell you something," he said, his voice tight. "And I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" Margaret stood very still, her hands folded in front of her, her face carefully blank. Henry recognized the posture now. It was armor, protection against whatever was coming. She had learned long ago that private conversations with masters rarely ended well. "I know who your father was," Henry said, and she flinched as if struck. "I know about the house on Rue Dolphin, about your mother, about the arrangement my father made. I know because I found his records. I found his letter." He slid the yellowed paper across the desk toward her. "Read it." Margaret did not move. "Sir, I don't think I should." His voice came out harsher than he meant, worn down by 3 days without sleep and too much emotion. "Please, I need you to read it." She approached the desk slowly, like someone stepping toward danger. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the letter. Henry watched her face as she read. He saw the moment understanding arrived, the moment the truth settled fully on her. Her fingers tightened, crumpling the edges of the paper. Her breathing grew fast and shallow. One tear slipped free and traced down her cheek. When she finished, she placed the letter back on the desk, smoothing the crease she had made. She looked at Henry with eyes filled with a lifetime of pain, unanswered questions, and grief that had nowhere to go. "You're my brother." Her voice was flat, empty of emotion, as if she were stating a simple fact rather than something that shattered her world. "Yes. And you've known since Christmas." "Yes." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was broken and bitter, full of pain she had been forced to swallow for years. "Of course you knew. You saw it in my face, just like I saw it in yours. I told myself I was imagining things, that I wanted it to be true so badly I made it up. I told myself fate could not be that cruel. But you knew." "I didn't know what to do," Henry said quietly. "I still don't." "You could free me." The words were simple, clear, devastating. "I will. I am. The papers are already being prepared." "But Margaret," he stopped, realizing it was the first time he had ever spoken her name without distance or title. "I don't want you to just disappear. I don't want to be another man who abandons you." "What do you want then?" Her voice sharpened, anger breaking through restraint. "Do you want me to be grateful? Do you want me to forgive our father for keeping my mother as property? For keeping me as property? For choosing his comfort over our freedom? Do you want me to thank you for doing what should have been done the day I was born? What exactly do you want from me, Henry?" Hearing his name from her lips felt like a blow to the chest. They shared blood, yet they were strangers. Worse than strangers. They were master and slave, owner and owned, separated by a distance that felt impossible to cross. "I want—" Henry struggled for words, trying to explain something he barely understood himself. "I want to know you. I want to understand who you are, what you want, what your life could be if you were free to choose it. I want to be your brother, not your master. I want the relationship we should have had from the beginning." "You can't be both," Margaret said quietly. The anger faded into something sadder, heavier. "As long as I'm enslaved, as long as I'm property, you can only be my master. That's how this system works. That's what our father understood, even if he pretended otherwise. You can't own someone and love them. You can't hold someone in chains and call it family." She was right, and Henry knew it. There was no middle path, no way to make this clean. He had been searching for comfort where none existed. "The papers will be ready in 2 weeks," he said, his voice rough. "I'm freeing you completely with enough money to build a life wherever you choose. New Orleans if you want to return, or somewhere else, somewhere new. The North perhaps where you'll be safer. The choice will be yours." "And then what?" Margaret asked. "Do we pretend we're strangers? Do we acknowledge what we are to each other? What does it mean to be siblings when we've lived in different worlds? When one of us owned the other, even if only for a short time?" Henry had no answer. The question was too big, shaped by a system designed to make such bonds impossible. "I don't know," he said at last. "But I think we have to try. For ourselves. And for your mother. She wanted better for you. She died believing you would have a chance at more than she had. Maybe we can honor that even if we can't fix everything else." Margaret's expression softened at the mention of Celeste. "She never spoke badly of him," she said. "She never told me his name, but she never said a cruel word either. I think she loved him in spite of everything. Or maybe because of it. I never understood how. How could she love someone who kept her enslaved? How could she forgive someone who chose his name over her freedom? Love is complicated," Henry said softly, "especially when it exists inside systems meant to destroy it. Maybe she didn't forgive him. Maybe she just understood that he was weak. Penance chose not to let his weakness control her." "Yes." Margaret moved toward the window, gazing out over the shadowed grounds. The moon was rising slowly, spilling silver light across the fields and over the quarters where the enslaved people lived. I used to imagine what it might be like to have a family, a real family, not just my mother and me in our tiny house, but brothers and sisters, a father who saw me, a place where I truly belonged. I would make up stories about them, dream about what they would be like, what we would do together. She turned back to Henry, and in the soft glow of moonlight, he could see tears glistening on her cheeks. And now I learn I have a brother, and he is the very man who owns me. The childhood stories I told myself never included a possibility like this. The pain in her voice was raw, unbearable. Henry wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to make it somehow better, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would fix the deep wrongness of their reality. They were both victims of their father's decisions, trapped in a system they did not create, yet both forced to navigate. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling the words fall short. "I'm sorry for all of it. For our father's choices, for the system that allowed them, for the fact that we meet under these circumstances instead of as we should have, meeting as family, as equals, as people free to decide the kind of bond we wanted. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't change anything," Margaret replied, but her voice was softer now, less sharp. "But I suppose it's something. It's more than our father ever gave my mother. More than most people in my position ever get." They stood quietly for a long moment, two people connected by blood yet separated by everything else, trying to find a path through a situation that seemed impossible. 2 weeks, Henry said finally. "In 2 weeks you'll be free, and then we'll figure out what comes next, together." Margaret nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "I've never had a brother. I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," Henry admitted. "But we'll learn. We have to." The 2 weeks before Margaret's manumission papers were finalized passed in a strange in-between. She continued her household duties, but the nature of her relationship with Henry had changed completely. They were no longer master and slave, yet not fully siblings either. They existed in a gray area, learning how to relate to each other without a guide, without precedent. Henry began seeking her counsel, asking her opinion on matters he once handled alone. He discovered she had insights into running the plantation that he had never considered, ways to improve efficiency, ways to treat the enslaved people more humanly without sacrificing productivity. She had spent her life observing systems from the standpoint of someone with no power within them. That perspective proved valuable in ways Henry was only starting to understand. Margaret, for her part, began to relax bit by bit, allowing glimpses of the person she might have been had she grown up free. She was intelligent, keen, with a dry wit that surprised Henry. Once, when he complained about a difficult business negotiation, she remarked sharply, "Perhaps if you stopped trying to be reasonable and simply said what you wanted, they would respect you more. Reasonable people are easy to manipulate." Henry laughed, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm too reasonable? I think you're trying to be a good person in a system that punishes goodness," she said. "It's admirable, but exhausting to watch." The words stung, yet Henry recognized the truth. He had been attempting to act morally in an immoral world, searching for a high ground that didn't exist. It was impossible, yet Margaret saw it clearly, with the clarity of someone who had no illusions left. One evening, they sat together in the library, a breach of protocol that would have shocked anyone who saw it, and shared memories of their childhoods. Henry spoke of growing up at Beller, the pressure of being the younger son, always overshadowed by his brother until Phipp's death made him heir. He talked about his studies in New Orleans and the law practice he was building before their father summoned him home. Margaret spoke of the house on Rue Dolphin, the careful balance her mother maintained between dignity and survival. She described the education that set her apart from other enslaved people, yet made her life more painful. "I could read Shakespeare," she said, "but I couldn't walk down the street without papers to prove I had permission. I could play chess, but I couldn't choose where I lived or who I spent time with. The education my mother gave me only made me more aware of what I lacked. Sometimes I wondered if ignorance would have been easier." "Do you resent her for it? For teaching you to want what you could never have?" Henry asked. Margaret thought carefully, eyes distant. No, she was trying to give me tools to survive, maybe to reach something better. She couldn't free me. She had no money, no power, no legal standing, but she could give me skills, knowledge, the ability to navigate different worlds. She did what she could with what she had. Like our father, Henry said bitterly, doing the best he could, which was never enough. No, Margaret agreed. It wasn't enough. But I've learned most people never do enough. Most choose comfort over justice, convenience over courage. Our father wasn't unusual, just human, weak, selfish, cowardly, human. Her generosity of perspective humbled Henry. She had every right to be angry, to hate their father and the system that oppressed her. Yet somehow, she found understanding, seeing humanity even in those who denied hers. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly. Margaret smiled, a real smile that made her look younger, lighter. "I'm a survivor. That's different from being extraordinary. Extraordinary is a luxury I've never been able to afford. I've just learned to adapt, to preserve myself in situations meant to destroy me." On the day her papers were finalized, Henry called Margaret into his study. The documents lay on his desk, legal proof of her freedom, signed, sealed, ready for the parish. Alongside them was a bank draft for $5,000, enough to let her live independently, to make real choices about her future. It's a substantial sum, more than most free people of color could hope to save in a lifetime. "It's done," he said, sliding the papers to her. "You're free." Margaret picked them up, hands trembling slightly, reading every line, every clause, as if hunting for a hidden condition. When she finished, she placed them down and looked at Henry with an expression he could not fully read. Relief, yes, but also grief, or the weight of new possibilities. "Thank you," she said simply. "Where will you go?" Henry asked, though he feared the answer. He had grown used to her presence, the comfort of having family, even in a complex, strange form. The thought of losing her left him hollow. "I don't know yet. I need time to think, to find out who I am when I'm not defined by my ties to others. I've been a daughter, someone's property, someone's responsibility all my life. I want to discover who I am just as myself, when I'm not playing a role to survive." Henry nodded, understanding but feeling a pang of loss. "Will you stay in Louisiana?" "Maybe, maybe not. That's the beauty of freedom. I get to choose where I go, what I do, who I become. It's terrifying and exciting all at once." She gathered the papers carefully, holding them as if they were priceless. At the doorway she paused and turned. "Henry." It was the first time she used his name without the formal "sir," and the sound felt like a gift. "Thank you for doing what our father could not. It doesn't erase the past, but it matters. It matters that you tried, that you saw me as a person, not property, that you're striving to be better than the system you inherited." After she left, Henry remained in the study for a long while, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had freed his sister, fulfilled his father's final orders, acted morally to the fullest of his understanding. Yet why did he feel like he had lost something irreplaceable? The answer came slowly. He had lost the chance at a normal sibling relationship, the possibility of knowing Margaret as brothers and sisters should. Their bond would always be marked by circumstance, by the fact that he had owned her, even briefly. That stain would never completely disappear. Perhaps that was right. Perhaps they should carry the memory, a reminder of the cost of the system they were born into. Margaret left Beller 3 days later, on a morning when fog rolled in from the river, turning the world gray and softening edges. Henry watched from the gallery as she climbed into the carriage that would take her to New Orleans, her few belongings packed in one trunk. She had refused any extra luggage, extra clothes, extra anything. "I want to start fresh," she said. "I want to choose everything myself, from my clothes to my furniture to the books on my shelves. I want everything in my life to belong to me, chosen by me." She looked up at him before the driver started off, raised one hand in farewell, and then she was gone, fading into the mist like a ghost, like something that had never fully been real. The household felt hollow without her. The other staff carried on with their tasks efficiently. Margaret had trained them well in the short time she had been at Beller, but something essential had disappeared. Henry realized that Margaret had brought balance to the plantation that had nothing to do with her abilities or efficiency. She had brought a chance for redemption, the hope that the wrongs of the past could somehow be addressed if not completely repaired. Now she was gone, and Henry was left alone with his inheritance and his guilt. He threw himself into running the plantation, but his heart was not in it. He looked at the enslaved people in his fields and saw Margaret in every face. He heard their voices and wondered what stories they carried, what families had been broken, what potential had been crushed beneath the weight of the system he upheld simply by existing, by keeping Bella running, by accepting the wealth that came from their labor. For the first time, Henry truly grasped what his fortune was built on. It wasn't just sugar and land and good market conditions. It was human suffering stretched across generations, normalized, legalized, and defended by those who benefited from it. His father had been one of those people. His grandfather had been one of those people. And now Henry was too. No matter how much he tried to be different, the truth was overwhelming. He began making changes at Beller. Small at first, then gradually more serious. He lowered work quotas, willing to accept smaller profits in exchange for less cruelty. He made sure families stayed together, refusing to sell anyone for money. He opened a school where enslaved children could learn to read and write, hiring a free woman of color from New Orleans to teach them. His neighbors noticed, of course. They commented on his softness, his impracticality, his dangerous ideas. Charles Beaumont, who had given him Margaret as a Christmas gift, confronted him one evening over brandy. "You're being foolish, Henry," Charles said bluntly, his face flushed from alcohol and irritation. "Treating them like human beings will only make them dissatisfied with their lot. You're creating trouble for yourself and the rest of us. If your slaves start expecting kindness, ours will too. You're undermining the whole system. They are human." "Charles," Henry replied quietly, "that isn't opinion, it's fact. Of course they are human, but they are also property. That's the law, that's how the world works. You can't change that by being soft." "The world changes," Henry said, looking steadily into his friend's eyes. "Laws change. What seems permanent and natural in one generation becomes unthinkable in the next. Slavery won't last forever, it cannot." Charles shook his head, setting down his glass harder than necessary. "You've become strange since your father died. I don't know what's come over you, but I hope you come to your senses before you ruin yourself. You're making enemies, Henry. People are talking. They say you sympathize with abolitionists, that you're dangerous." "Let them talk," Henry said, though the warning made a chill run down his spine. In Louisiana in 1847, being called an abolitionist could be deadly, but he could not return to the way things had been. He could not unsee what he had seen, could not unknow what he now understood. Henry did not tell Charles about Margaret. He did not reveal that his sister had been enslaved, that he had owned her, that the abstract moral questions Charles dismissed so easily had become painfully personal. Some truths were too risky to share, too likely to destroy the fragile social position he was trying to maintain, even as he worked quietly to undermine the system. In June, a letter arrived from New Orleans. Henry recognized Margaret's handwriting instantly and tore it open with hands that trembled. "Dear Henry," it began, and the simple greeting made his throat tighten. "I am writing to let you know that I am well and settling into my new life. I have rented rooms in the French Quarter in a boarding house run by a free woman of color who has been very kind to me. The freedom to make choices still feels strange. Sometimes I catch myself waiting for permission to do things I now have every right to do. But I am learning, I am becoming someone new. Or maybe I am becoming who I always was underneath the roles I had to play to survive. I have been thinking a lot about our father, about the decisions he made and the legacy he left behind. I cannot hate him, though perhaps I should. He was a man trapped in a system that corrupted everyone it touched, and he lacked the courage to oppose it. That makes him weak, but not monstrous. Most people are weak when tested. Most choose comfort over principle. But you, Henry, you had a choice, and you did the right thing. You could have kept me enslaved, kept the secret, protected yourself. Instead, you chose the difficult and right path. That matters. It does not fix everything, but it matters. I don't know what our relationship will be going forward. We are siblings, but we are also strangers shaped by very different experiences. Maybe we will find a way to truly know each other. Or maybe we will remain distant, connected by blood, but divided by history. Either way, I want you to know I don't blame you for my birth or the years I spent in bondage. You inherited a terrible situation and handled it with more grace than I had any right to expect. Thank you for giving me my freedom. Thank you for seeing me as a human being rather than property. Thank you for being the brother our father never allowed you to be. With affection and hope, Margaret. Henry read the letter over and over, each time feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. She was safe, she was free, she did not hate him. But she was also gone, living a life separate from his, and he did not know if he would ever see her again. He wrote back at once a long letter in which he tried to express all he felt: the guilt, the anger at their father, the strange grief of discovering family only to lose them again. He told her about the changes he was making at Beller, about his growing discomfort with the system he was part of, about the uncertainty of what he should do with the knowledge and privilege he had inherited. Her reply arrived a month later with advice that would change his life. "You ask what you should do," she wrote. "I cannot tell you that. No one can make that choice for you. But I can tell you what I have learned. We cannot change the past, but we can refuse to continue it. You own 170 people, 170 human beings whose lives are in your hands. You cannot free them all without destroying yourself. I understand the economic and social consequences would be severe, and the courts would likely stop you anyway. But you can treat them with dignity. You can make sure families are not separated. You can teach them to read, give them skills, prepare them for the day when this cruel system finally ends. And it will end, Henry. It cannot last forever. You can be the master who makes slavery a little less cruel. Even as you work toward a world where masters are no longer needed, it is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something, and something is better than nothing." Henry followed Margaret's guidance as best he could. He made changes at Beller gradually, carefully, in ways that would not draw too much attention from neighbors or authorities. He kept families together, refusing all offers to buy individual workers regardless of the price. He opened the school and made attendance required for all children under 12, arguing to skeptical overseers that educated workers were more valuable. He reduced the harsh quotas that had made harvest season brutal, accepting lower profits for less suffering. He improved the living quarters, ensuring adequate food, clothing, and medical care. He stopped using the whip, instead using a system of privileges and restrictions that was less violent, though still controlling. His neighbors noticed, of course. They commented on his softness, impracticality, and dangerous ideas. Some stopped doing business with him. Others warned him he was setting a bad example and that his workers would become spoiled and hard to manage. A few suggested, not entirely without reason, that he might be an abolitionist sympathizer, which in 1840s Louisiana was a serious accusation. But Henry persisted. He could not free the people he owned. The law and economy made that impossible, but he could make their lives less harsh. He could prepare them for a future he hoped would be better, even if he could not see when or how it would arrive. He and Margaret wrote to each other often. She had opened a small school in New Orleans, teaching free people of color and enslaved children whose masters allowed them to attend. It was dangerous work. Education was seen as a threat to the social order, and laws limited what could be taught to enslaved people. But she pursued it with quiet determination, finding ways to work inside the system while subtly undermining it. "I am teaching them what my mother taught me," she wrote in one letter, "that knowledge is power, that dignity cannot be taken or given by others, that they are fully human no matter what the law says. It is small work, but it is my work. It is how I choose to live in the world our father left behind." Henry admired her bravery even as he worried for her safety. New Orleans was more tolerant than the rural parishes, but there were limits to that tolerance. A free woman of color who was too educated, too independent, too outspoken could quickly find herself in danger. The system had ways of punishing those who challenged it, using subtle methods and sometimes blatant ones to enforce compliance. His fears came true in September of 1849 when he received a frantic letter from one of Margaret's students. There had been a raid on her school by local authorities. prompted by a complaint from someone upset that enslaved people were being taught to read. Margaret had been arrested for teaching enslaved people without authorization, for possessing abolitionist writings, and for a dozen other accusations that ultimately amounted to the crime of being too free, too defiant of the social order. Henry rushed to New Orleans, leaving Beller under the care of his most trusted overseer. He called in every favor he could, spent money he could barely afford, and used every connection he had. It took 3 days and a substantial bribe to the right officials, but finally he got her out of the parish jail. When he saw her, she was thinner, with bruises on her arms and a cut above her eye that was still healing. Yet her spirit remained unbroken, her eyes alive with determination. "I won't stop," she told him in a quiet cafe by the river, speaking softly so as not to be overheard. "I can't stop. This is the only thing that makes sense to me, the only way I know to fight back against what was done to me, to my mother, to all of us." "You'll get yourself killed," Henry said sharply, fear hardening his voice. "Then I'll die free," Margaret replied, holding his gaze steadily. "That's more than my mother had, more than most like me ever will have. I won't live in fear, Henry. I won't make myself small just to make others comfortable. I've spent too much of my life doing that already." Henry wanted to argue, to convince her to be more cautious, to protect herself, but he knew it was pointless. She had found her purpose, her way of turning her suffering into meaning. He had no right to take that from her, even if it terrified him. "Let me help," he said instead. "Money, connections, whatever you need. Let me be useful." Margaret smiled, and for a moment he saw the sister she might have been if they had grown up together in a different world. "You're already useful, Henry. You're showing that people can change, that they can be better than the systems they inherit. That matters more than you know. Every person you treat with respect, every family you keep together, every child you teach to read, it all matters. You're planting seeds for a future you may never see, but that doesn't make the work any less important." Years passed, and the country moved inexorably toward a conflict that everyone could sense but no one could prevent. Tensions between North and South worsened, debates over slavery grew heated, and compromise seemed impossible. Henry continued his work at Beller, making small improvements, treating the people he owned with as much dignity as the system allowed, preparing them for a future he hoped might be different. Margaret moved her school constantly to stay ahead of authorities, teaching anyone eager to learn. She became known in New Orleans as someone reliable, someone who would help enslaved people learn to read, provide papers for escape, and offer shelter to those in need. It was dangerous work, yet she thrived on it, finding a purpose that gave her life meaning. They saw each other infrequently. Social complications and Henry's growing reputation as an abolitionist sympathizer made close contact risky. But they wrote often, their letters documenting two people striving to remain a family despite the barriers between them. In 1853, Margaret's news surprised Henry. She was engaged to a free man of color, Thomas Laurent, a carpenter who had built a successful business in New Orleans. She described him as kind, intelligent, and supportive of her work. "I never thought I'd marry," she wrote. "I never thought I could trust anyone enough to share my life. But Thomas sees me truly. He sees me not as property, a symbol, or a problem to be solved, but as myself. He knows my history, our father, and you, and he loves me anyway. It's a gift I never expected." Henry traveled to New Orleans for the wedding, a small ceremony in a Catholic church in the French Quarter. He sat in the back, unnoticed, watching his sister marry a man who looked at her with obvious love and respect. When she caught his eye, she smiled, and Henry felt a knot of guilt and grief from 6 years earlier loosen in his chest. Afterwards they spoke briefly in the courtyard. Thomas shook Henry's hand firmly but not aggressively, eyes assessing him carefully. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, resting her hand on Thomas's arm. "It means a lot." "I wouldn't have missed it," Henry replied. "I'm truly happy for you." She squeezed his hand briefly. "And I'm grateful for everything you've done, everything you continue to do. You're a good man, Henry. Our father would have been proud." Henry wasn't sure. He suspected their father would have been horrified by the ways Henry had disrupted the arrangements that kept Margaret hidden. But it didn't matter. Margaret was free, happy, and building a life on her terms. That was enough. Henry returned to Bellur, observing the country's decline toward war. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, he felt a strange relief. The burden of maintaining a humane facade in a cruel system had been exhausting. The war years were harsh. Union forces occupied Bellur in 1862, and Henry found himself welcoming the army that destroyed his livelihood. The enslaved people on his land were freed by military order, most leaving immediately to reunite with family or simply taste freedom. Henry offered what help he could: money, letters of reference, blessings, but did not attempt to stop anyone. Some thanked him, acknowledging his small efforts, while others departed silently, a reminder that no kindness could undo the fundamental wrong of ownership. By 1865, Bellur was a shadow of its former self. Fields were overgrown, machinery broken, and the grand house showed neglect that Henry could not afford to repair. He sold most of the land, keeping only the house and a few acres. He was 49, and the world he knew was gone. In 1868, Margaret wrote inviting him to New Orleans. She and Thomas had survived the war despite challenges. Their school had been destroyed, their home damaged, their savings depleted. Yet they had rebuilt, and the school was now fully operational, teaching formerly enslaved people to read, write, and navigate their new freedom. Henry traveled through a scarred landscape of abandoned fields and ruined buildings, arriving in a chaotic city still finding its new order. Margaret met him at the station, and he was struck by how much she had changed. At 34, her face bore the marks of hard years, but her confidence was radiant. "Welcome," she said, embracing him naturally. "Come see what we've built." The school was in a converted warehouse, filled with students of all ages, from children to elderly people learning to read for the first time. Thomas taught a math class, patient and steady. "This is what freedom looks like," Margaret said, watching her students with pride. "It's messy, difficult, uncertain, but it's real. People are building their own lives, making choices, learning skills. They are becoming who they were always meant to be." Henry felt tears prick his eyes. "Your mother would be proud." "Yes," Margaret agreed softly. "She would, and I think our father would be too, despite everything. He wanted this for me, but lacked the courage. His weakness led to something good, my freedom, this school, and lives changed every day. Sometimes good things arise from bad beginnings." They walked the city, talking about the past, the future, and the country struggling to rebuild. Margaret shared plans to expand the school and create opportunities for freed men trying to find their place in a hostile society. "Will you help?" she asked by the levee, the Mississippi flowing beside them. "I know you don't have much left, but anything, money, connections, advice, will make a difference." "Of course," Henry said. "Whatever I have is yours, always has been." Margaret smiled and held his hand, a simple but profound gesture. "We're family, Henry. Not because the law says so, but because we choose to be. That is what freedom truly means, the ability to choose who we are and who we love." As the sun set over the Mississippi, turning the water gold and orange, Henry realized that redemption wasn't a single grand gesture, but a long, difficult process of making better choices, repairing what was broken and building something new from the ruins of the past. He had inherited his father's sins, but also the chance to do better. With Margaret's courage, vision, and refusal to be defined by her suffering, he was learning how. It couldn't erase the past. Years of slavery, the suffering of hundreds at Bellur, families torn apart, none of that could be undone. But it was something. Margaret's earlier words were true. Something was better than nothing. They were siblings finally, not as master and slave, but as two people connected by blood and choice, working to build a world where such horrors could not happen again. It was a small victory in a country still struggling with slavery's legacy, but it was theirs, earned through pain, courage, and the refusal to let the past dictate the future. In the end, all anyone could do was take the broken pieces and build something better. The story of Henry and Margaret Dufresne ended not with perfect resolution, but with hope. In a world as fractured as theirs had been, hope was enough. This tale reminds us that the darkest secrets often lie not in the supernatural, but in human choices and the systems we uphold. What do you think of this story? Was everything revealed, or do secrets still linger in Louisiana's past? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries, subscribe to Antebellum South, click the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next video.